Hello. Katharine Hayhoe is our featured speaker. She is an atmospheric scientist who studies climate change and why it matters to us here and now, and what we can do to fix it. Her research focuses on developing and applying high-resolution climate projections to understand what climate change means for people and for the natural environment. Dr. Hayhoe has a BSc in physics and master's and PhD in atmospheric science. She is a Paul Horn Distinguished Professor and the Political Science Endowed Professor in Public Policy and Public Law at Texas Tech University. In addition, she serves as Chief Scientist for the Nature Conservancy. She's also a remarkable communicator who has received many awards, such as the National Center for Science Education's Friend of the Planet Award and the Sierra Club's Distinguished Service Award. She has been named a United Nations Champion of the Earth in Science and Innovation, one of Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People, and one of Fortune Magazine's World's Greatest Leaders. She has served as lead author on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th National Climate Assessments in the United States. And she serves on advisory committees for organizations including the Smithsonian Natural History Museum and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She also hosts and produces the PBS digital series, Global Weirding. Her TED Talk, called, quote, "The most important thing you can do to fight climate change, talk about it," unquote, has millions of views. Her most recent book is Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world. A few months ago, she was the keynote speaker in a symposium at the New York Botanical Garden about forests and mitigating climate change. There is much more, but now it is time to welcome Dr. Hayhoe.
Thank you so much. It is great to be with you here today. We are going to be interacting using Poll Everywhere. I just put the link there in the chat, and let me share my screen with you too, because I want to be able to ask you questions as well as giving you the opportunity to ask me questions. So if you don't mind, on your phone or on your computer, on your tablet, on anything you want, go to pollev.com/Katharine. You have to spell it right if you're typing it in. There's 2 A's there. Or the easy thing on your phone is you literally just take your phone and you take a picture of that QR code on the left, and the website will pop right up. It might ask you for your name, but you don't have to do that. Just push skip. And I want to ask you a few questions. And the first question is a very easy question. You just need to click. And the first question I have to ask you is this: where are you joining us from today? Now, if you're not in the United States, that's okay. You can click off the edge. It looks like we have somebody from Ontario already doing that. Just click off the edge in the direction that you are joining us from. So it looks like we have a fair amount of people from the Midwest, a number of people from Colorado and from the West Coast, a lot of East Coast folks there. It looks like a few from Canada or over in Europe. Excellent. Somebody from Florida, Oregon and Washington State are joining in. Somebody from Alaska. That's wonderful. A few from Virginia. Some more from New York, Vermont, New Hampshire. Excellent. So now I'm going to ask you another question. The questions are, each one's getting slightly harder. And this next question, you have to answer with words, not with clicking on a map. The next question is, given who you are, what is your favorite plant? I know this is a difficult question because you have to pick one. What is your favorite plant? I just want to know. Blue panda, somebody says. All right, iris. Milkweed, excellent. That's a great one for the butterflies. Willow. Oak tree. Great. Hibiscus, very nice. Oh, ginkgo biloba. All right. Orchid. To make it even harder, I would ask what type of orchid, because there's a lot of them. Columbine. Jasmine, that smells amazing. Ferns. Yes, ferns are good for all kinds of things, including some are very edible. Geranium. Excellent. Oak. Looks like we have 2 oaks here. Blueberry. That's an interesting answer. Yeah. Why not? Excellent. I love this. Tulip. I have to say that's one of my personal favorites too, because I'm born in April. And so I was always wondering if the tulips would be out by my birthday. And thanks to the fact that we have much warmer conditions now, the tulips are always out by my birthday in April. Swamp milkweed. I love that. Wild rice. Yes. Anemones. That's amazing. And dogwood. That's a good one too. All right. Oh, and the tulip tree. Yes, the tulip tree is gorgeous. Okay, so now I have one more question to ask you. And this next question, you have to answer with only one word. Not 2 words, not 3 words, only one word. And this next question is not a fun question. This question is about what we're talking about today. The next question I have for you, and I hate to stop this because I love seeing your answers to this, but the next question I have for you is, since I'm a climate scientist, when I say climate change, how do you feel? So let me go there. And when I say climate change, how do you feel in just one word? That is a good word right there. And you know what? I have asked this question over the last few years to all kinds of different people. I've asked students and senior citizens. I've asked healthcare professionals and architects. I've asked, people in the entertainment industry. I've asked Catholic nuns. I have asked all kinds of people how they feel about climate change. You know what? I get the same answers no matter who I'm speaking to. Scared, sad, concerned, depressed, anxious, hopeless, fearful, devastated, worried, challenged, apprehensive, and even guilty. And you know what? If you feel this way, it's completely justified based on what the science tells us. So what does the science actually say about this issue of climate change? It's very clear that it's real. We have checked whether it could possibly be volcanoes or the sun or natural cycles, and no, it is not. According to natural factors, the Earth should be getting very slowly cooler right now, not warmer. Is this unusual? The answer is yes. As far back as we can go in the history of our planet, we have never seen this much carbon going into the atmosphere this quickly. How is it happening? Well, it all started back at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when we started to dig up increasing amounts of coal back then and more oil and gas today and burn it, producing heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. That's what's causing the Earth to run a fever. Now, some people might say, yeah, but I've heard it's just, 2 degrees warmer. Well, what we have to understand is that over the course of human civilization on this planet, and that's what's at risk, us humans and many of the living things that share this planet with us, over the course of human civilization, the temperature of the planet has been as stable as that of the human body. Our body temperature goes up and down by a few tenths of a degree over the course of a day, and that's normal. The average temperature of the Earth goes up and down by a few tenths of a degree from year to year and decade to decade, and that's normal. But if you're running a 2-degree fever, you feel achy, you're taking Tylenol, you're wondering what you have, you're low energy, you're thinking of going to see the doctor. That's exactly what's happening to our planet. We're running a 2-degree fever right now, and we're starting to feel the impacts. And if it goes higher, we're in serious trouble. How long have we known about this? Is this just some new science that we figured out the last, decade or two? Are scientists still arguing about this? No, despite what you might have heard, scientists are not arguing about this. In fact, we are 99.9999% sure, and that's about as sure as scientists get, that this thing is real and it's us. Why? Because the scientists who figured this out lived back in the 1800s. They were the ones, for example, Joseph Fourier figured out that our planet would be a frozen ball of ice if we didn't have an amazing natural blanket of heat-trapping gases, keeping us the perfect temperature for life. John Tyndall was the one who figured out that digging up coal actually releases more of these heat-trapping gases. And Mrs. Eunice Foote, an amateur scientist from upstate New York, she calculated how much warmer the world would get depending on the heat-trapping gases that build up in the atmosphere in 1856. Svante Arrhenius was a Swedish chemist who actually calculated, as humans keep on producing these gases, if we double or triple the level of heat trapping gases in the atmosphere, how much warmer it will get. And then lastly, Guy Callender was a British engineer, although born in Canada, so we will claim him too, who rode around the world, collected temperature records from around the world, added them all up, and in 1937 published a paper showing that the planet was warming because of burning fossil fuels. That's how long we've known about this. So now the question is, well, so what's new? I mean, if we've known about it for this long, why are we still studying it? There's a lot that's new today. For example, we know there was a big scientific report that just came out last week. You might have heard the news about the latest big climate report that just came out. One of the conclusions is that we humans have never seen this much warming this fast. We have not seen that. We also know that climate change is loading the weather dice against us. We've always had droughts and heat waves and wildfires and floods. That's just part of life on this planet. But we know that the warmer it gets, the more intense our droughts get, the more dangerous our heat waves are, the more area our wildfires are burning, and the faster our hurricanes are intensifying and they're dumping a lot more rain on us. We see this news every day. Supersized disasters, again, disasters have always happened, but they're being supersized in a warmer world. I think of it like a pair of dice. So wherever you live, you always have a chance of rolling a double six, right? You could always get a drought or a heat wave or a storm or a flood. But as the world warms decade by decade, it's like climate change is sneaking in and taking one of these numbers and then another one and turning them into sixes. And then it's even taking one of the numbers or two and turning them into sevens or eights. And all of a sudden, people are like, well, I've lived in Houston all my life, but we just had 3 500-year flood events in 3 years. What's up with that? That's climate change loading the weather dice against us. And that's why, rather than calling this global warming, I always call it global weirding. Things are just getting weirder. If you look at the number of weather-related disasters in the US and the cost of those disasters, of course, the value of money changes over time, so that's accounted for here. Back in the 1980s, we had one disaster that caused the equivalent of today's at least $1 billion. One of those disasters on average every 4 months. Now we've got one every 3 weeks. These risks are increasing, and we can even calculate how much worse climate change made it. The floods in Germany, 7 times more likely. The heat wave and wildfires in the Pacific Northwest in June 2021, 150 times more likely. Hurricane Harvey, 40% more rain. Quadruple the economic damages. We can study how climate change is making this worse. What else is new today? We know that this is not just an environmental issue. We know that these changes are affecting our homes and our infrastructure. They're affecting the economy. They're affecting our energy resources. They're affecting our water and our natural resources and our food. They're affecting our health, biodiversity, nature, and they're disproportionately affecting those who've done the least to cause the problem. Climate change today is now an everything issue. It's quite literally affecting the food we eat, not only through droughts and heat waves that affect food abundance, but through increasing levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which cause plants to grow faster, but as a result, the crops they produce have lower nutritional content. So to get the same amount of nutrition, you have to eat more. And that doesn't matter so much to us. We get our food from the grocery store, but for people who grow their own food, for the billions of people living at or below the poverty line, this is a serious issue. It also affects the water that we drink. Drought in one place, flood and water contamination in another. Water resources are becoming ever more scarce, even as our population grows. It's affecting the nature that surrounds us, whether it's an urban park or the remote location in the mountains. It's affecting the air that we breathe. Burning fossil fuels produces heat-trapping gases, but it also produces air pollution. And air pollution from fossil fuels is responsible for 10 million premature deaths every year. That's double the number of COVID deaths at the height of the pandemic, in addition to all the impacts it has on other living things. And then, like I mentioned, there's our buildings and our roads and all the systems we use that were built for a planet that no longer exists. It's literally not about saving the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. It's about saving us. And by us, I mean all of us living things on this planet, humans, animals, plants. It affects all of us, but it doesn't affect us all equally. When you look at who's produced most of the heat trapping gases that are causing this problem and who's bearing the brunt of the impacts, the 50% poorest people in the world are responsible for 7% of the problem. But if you look at who's being most impacted by how climate change is loading the weather dice against us, which countries are at the top of the list? Malawi, Somalia, Eritrea, Niger, Mozambique, Tajikistan, not the countries that are producing a lot of the emissions. Climate change disproportionately affects women. It disproportionately affects Indigenous people. It disproportionately affects low-income neighborhoods right here where we live. And this interacts with another crisis we're confronting right now, which is the biodiversity crisis. 80% of the world's biodiversity is present on lands that are managed by Indigenous peoples, but Indigenous peoples are one of the groups of people who are most impacted by climate change. So this is a graphic that shows two things. At the top, we have the warming stripes. Each line is a year, and this shows how over time, our planet has been getting warmer and warmer. If the year was colder than average, it's blue. If it's warmer than average, it's red. And you can see it moves towards red over time. So what's the line on the bottom? The line on the bottom is biodiversity loss. This is showing from 1970 to 2018. Green is large biodiversity. And then we head towards yellow and gray, which means our biodiversity is also declining. And the health of the planet, we've learned the last few years, is our health. So that's why if you said anxious, scared, depressed, sad, concerned, what you said makes perfect sense. That is a rational, logical response to the information that science is telling us. So as I go along now, I'm going to go ahead and open up questions. So if you have any questions, don't put them in the Zoom Q&A. If you have any questions, put them in here. And the fun part about this is you can upvote the questions you most want me to answer at the end. So I'm going to leave this open as I go along. You can put a question in at any time using pollev.com/Katharine. You can check out what other people have put in there and you can upvote the ones you want me to get to. But at this point, we have to say, well, what are we going to do about this? Surely if everybody knew about this, they would change their minds, right? Well, unfortunately, that's not the way we function as humans. It just isn't. We certainly have the facts that you've seen. If you look for scientific studies on climate change, you get over 2.6 million of them. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that just released its 6th report, or series of reports last week, they have the facts and they've been publishing the facts since 1990. That's 33 years. Many experts have communicated the facts. This is a letter signed by 11,000 scientists, clearly and unequivocally stating that we are facing a climate emergency. We communicate these facts in as many different ways as we can. We've got scientists on social media, we've got scientists making videos, we've got scientists chaining themselves to the banks that fund fossil fuels, we've got scientists telling other moms who are moms that we need to act on this. We're trying to get the word out every way we can. And you know what? It isn't quite working. Why not? There's a couple of reasons I want to get into these with you because I think they're really interesting. And once we understand them, we can avoid the traps that we've fallen into before. First of all, people don't really have a genuine problem with the actual science that explains why climate is changing. How do I know that? Because it's the exact same physics that explains how airplanes fly, how stoves heat food, and how fridges cool it. It's the same physics. And although we see people questioning the science of climate change, we don't see a lot of people questioning stoves, fridges, and airplanes. What is going on with climate change? This figure explains a lot more than any scientific diagrams. This is a figure from the Pew Research Center in February 2020, just before the COVID pandemic peaked. What it's showing is a whole bunch of different issues like budget deficit, global trade, jobs, education, healthcare costs, and climate change. What are we looking at here? We are looking at how politically polarized people are on these different issues. The width of the gray bar shows how far apart people are depending on where they vote. And the widest gray bar is at the top. What is that wide gray bar? It is climate change. Climate change has been, for the last 15 years, the most politically polarized issue in the country. Now you might say, okay, but then, COVID happened, so then what? Well, a year later, they did the same study. And a year later, this is a little bit different. A year later, they showed that the widest bars are, again, right at the top. The widest bar is basically tied here between addressing issues around race and dealing with COVID, and then dealing with global climate change. So they're still right there at the top. And this is not unique to the United States. A study that looked at 56 countries around the world found that what people thought about climate change was not determined as much by education or by experience as it was by their values, their ideologies, their worldviews, and their political orientation. The biggest correlation is with political affiliation. And then another study, they found out when people who are politically liberal know more about climate change, they get more concerned. But in rich countries, it's the opposite. So one of my colleagues, Dan Kahan, whenever I show you other people's work, I like to show you who they are. He's found that people who are most scientifically literate are not most concerned about climate change. Rather, they are the ones who are most polarized. And he concluded, I'm going to translate this into English. Here we go. Being smarter doesn't make us more accepting of science. It just makes us better able to argue that we're right. So where do we get this information from? Does a thermometer actually give us a different answer depending on how we vote? No. Do the flowers in our garden bloom at different times of the year, earlier, for more liberal and later for more conservative? Absolutely not. So how does this get so politically polarized? Well, Tali Sherrod is a neuroscientist who studies how our brain works. And what she says is our brains are programmed to get a kick out of information, but when we give people new information, we typically only accept it if we already believe it. And if it contradicts what we hear from people we trust, our brain shuts off. So that's why more information is not going to fix the problem. The problem is not lack of education or knowledge or intelligence. What's the problem? All of us, almost all of us, I should say, have two big problems when it comes to climate change. We don't understand why it matters to me here and now, and we don't know what we can do to fix it, or we think we do know and we don't want to do it. There's names for these two things. The first one's called psychological distance, and the second one is called solution aversion. What is psychological distance? Well, psychological distance is something we are all prey to as humans. We are prone to seeing risks as being far away from us in time or in space, or being abstract rather than concrete, or being irrelevant to our concerns. I mean, that doesn't matter to me, we think. So all of us do this. We don't eat what we're supposed to. We don't stand up and walk around every 30 minutes like we're supposed to. We don't exercise as much as we should. We probably don't save enough money as we should. We're all prone to psychological distance. And with climate change, it ticks every single box. And I have the data to prove it. Ready? So this is a survey that the Yale Program in Climate Communication does across the whole United States. Each little region there is a county. And they asked people a bunch of questions. They said, do you think global warming is happening? And most people said yes. Everywhere that said yes is orange, and the darker orange it is, the more people said yes. It's a really fun website. You can actually dig into your county and get results for your area if you're interested. So people agree it's happening. And then they said, do you think it's going to harm plants and animals? And just about the same number of people said yes. Now, where's the psychological distance there? In relevance. We're talking about non-human species here. So people are like, sure, it's real. It's going to harm plants and animals. What about people in the future? Yeah, it's going to harm them too. Where's the distance in time? How is it going to affect people in developing countries? Well, most people agree it will harm them too, distant in space. And then they ask people this question: do you think it will affect you? Look at that. Almost the entire country flips blue. You might wonder who lives in those yellow areas. Well, it turns out that there are a couple of groups of people demographically who are very concerned about climate change. The most concerned groups are Hispanic Catholics and Native Americans. Now you might say, well, of course, because the Pope did that encyclical back in 2015 about climate change. But it's not the Pope, because white Catholics, along with white evangelical Protestants, are least concerned about climate change. And when you dig into it, it turns out it's all politics and no theology. But that's a different talk. Anyways, what this shows is that we understand it's real, but we don't think it affects us. And I have some global data too, because I know that although this is the American branch, you are a global society. So I just wanted to share some global data too. Around the world, the gray countries are countries that weren't surveyed by the Yale group. So just the countries that were surveyed are colored. Around the world, the vast majority of people agree it's real. And most people are worried about climate change. The only country that was not red was Yemen. And it should be, because they've had terrible droughts there. But when you say, will it harm future generations? Again, most people say, sure, it'll probably harm future generations in the future. But will it affect you? Look at this, it almost all flips blue. And even the red areas are very light red. In fact, Chile and Mozambique are the only countries that are darker red. So how do we address this challenge? We have to talk about what's happening in a way that makes it imminent. It's now, not then. It's here, not over there. It's concrete. It's not global average temperature. It's what's happening where I live, and it's relevant to me. We also have to talk about the other half, though. What can we do to fix it? People want solutions that give us a better life and a better world, not a worse one. And so many of the solutions we hear about when it comes to climate change are about taking away things that we value. You can't eat meat. You can't drive a truck. You can't travel. You can't have kids. I even have people say to me, everybody has to sacrifice to fix climate change. And I'm like, well, if that's your only solution, we're never going to do it. We need solutions that are good for us, solutions that we enjoy, solutions that make our lives better. And people are willing to change if we feel like we can make a difference. The word for that is efficacy. If we think that what we can do to make it will make a difference, that's when we will act. But you know what? Currently, we don't feel that way. So how do we tackle this issue of psychological distance and building efficacy? We have to start by doing something that most of us aren't doing. Now, some of us are doing, but the vast majority of us are not doing this. You might say, okay, so what is that? Like, I've changed my light bulbs, I compost. No, I'm not talking about any of those personal actions. We go back to the figures we just looked at. We left off here. Do you think climate change will affect you personally? Most people said no, but there is one map that is darker blue. And you know what that is? Do you ever talk about it? It turns out the answer is pretty much no. Even in Seattle and San Francisco, it's just very lightly orange. Most people don't talk about it. And when we look at the world, I have the global data too, no, most places don't talk about it. There's a few exceptions. We've got Scandinavian countries, we've got Western Europe, we've got Australia, but most places don't talk about it. And here's the connection. If you don't talk about something, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would you ever want to do anything about it? So I'm absolutely convinced that every single one of us has a key role to play in this issue that begins with something so simple that we've neglected it. Having a conversation. Now, often when I say this, people immediately jump to, well, I have an uncle, and I have an uncle too. Or you might have a brother-in-law, or you might have a neighbor, you might have a colleague, the person who is always bringing up things like those scientists are just biased, they're in it for the money, or there's more polar bears now than there ever used to be, or it's just a natural cycle. And we think, finally, she's going to tell me how to have a conversation with these people. Unfortunately, I am not. Because if we have a conversation that just begins with something we disagree on, like Calvin and Susie here, it typically ends by digging a trench rather than building a bridge, and possibly something like this. But here's the good news. Most of us don't fall into that category. We aren't just us or them, believers or deniers. I don't even like those words anyways. Where we fall in climate change falls along a spectrum. And you know what? The majority of us are alarmed, concerned, and cautious. A small percent are disengaged, 12% are doubtful, and only 8% at the end are truly dismissive. And that my personal definition of dismissive is if an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone appeared before somebody who's dismissive and said global warming is real, they would still dismiss that. So why would anything we say make a difference? I'm not talking about having conversations with someone who's dismissive. If you know someone who is dismissive, who's just absolutely obsessed with the idea that this isn't real, the best thing to do is to say, I'm sorry, let's just talk about something else. Or if it's your family member or someone close to you, I love you, I'm sorry, let's talk about something else. But with everybody else, with the 92% of us who are not dismissive, we absolutely can have positive, constructive conversations. So then at this point, you might be thinking, and many people often say to me, okay, I get it. They just aren't worried. Here's me, and most of the people I know, we're worried, but here's the other people, they're not worried and they don't want to talk about it. So what we have to do is we have to make them worried. But this is not how we actually feel about climate change. Most people are already worried around the world. You already saw that data. But half of us feel hopeless and helpless and don't know where to start. And only a tiny percentage, in fact, 8% are activated. Isn't that interesting? 8% dismissive, 8% activated. So our goal is not to make people more worried because most people are already worried. They're just not activated. The vast majority are worried. A very small group say they're not worried, but often I think they are worried, maybe more about the solutions than the impacts. And only a tiny group are activated. We need to help worried people be activated. And how do we do that? That's very different than talking about ice sheets and polar bears. That doesn't activate anybody. It worries people, but it doesn't activate them. And how does this work with our brains? Well, if you look at the neuroscience again, I mentioned Tali Sharati earlier. Understanding how our brains work makes it clear why this doesn't work. If climate changes and we get worried and we share more scary data and people don't know what to do about it, which they don't, we know they don't because that's what they say in surveys, people reject it even more. We're just paralyzed. We want to just go back to bed and pull the blanket up over our head. Inaction results. And this is exactly what the neuroscience says. Fear and anxiety cause humans to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. And so climate just changes more. It's the cycle of doom. How do we break the cycle of doom? It's not by starting arguments with the people we know who are dismissive. It's not by dumping fear-based facts about ice sheets, sea level rise, and polar bears on people who are already worried. It's by starting with real hope, realistic hope that says, you know, it's bad. Success is not inevitable, but there is a better future possible. And you know what? There's a path to get there, and this is what the path looks like. So why do we talk about that? We have to talk about how climate change matters here and now and what we can do to fix it. I was talking to some folks in Iowa the other day, and they said, well, okay, that's fine, but how do you talk about polar bears where I live? And I said, you probably know what I said now, right? I said, you don't. Not unless polar bears are a big thing in Iowa. Instead, when I'm in Texas, I talk about cotton farming with Jack and droughts. If I'm in Arizona with my colleague, Jo Allen, we talk about how the extreme heat is affecting our kids and how she has to wake up her kids early in the morning because that's the only time they can play outside before it gets too hot. If I'm in the city, I talk about the crazy floods we have and how I couldn't even get my son to school because it flooded so much. We can talk about the amazing nature that surrounds us and the changes that we're seeing. We can talk about how, you know, in one place there's no snow, in another place there's too much snow. Talk about global weirding. To care about climate change, we don't have to be a certain type of person. We just have to be a human being living on this planet. And there is, without a doubt, at least one or two or three ways that you can connect your head to your heart. And we can do that with everyone. We also need to talk, though, about what we need to do to fix it. What do climate solutions look like? There's climate solutions that stop carbon from going into the atmosphere. clean energy and efficiency. We waste so much of our energy and our food. That's a huge way to help. I love nature-based solutions that take carbon out of the atmosphere through protecting ecosystems, restoring ecosystems, including forests, grasslands, coastal wetlands, and through climate-smart agriculture, regenerative agricultural practices that put that carbon back in the soil where we want it, instead of up in the atmosphere where we don't. I love climate solutions that help people in need, like low-income neighborhoods in some of our, the cities where we live ourselves. During a heat wave, they can be 15 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than a neighbor in a high-income area in the same city. Why? Because they don't have green spaces, they don't have trees. So greening low-income neighborhoods protects people from heat waves, helps filter the air because trees clean up pollution, provides a place for rain to go when it rains so you don't flood, takes up carbon too, and provides a place to go with family, friends, spending some time outside in nature. I love the fact that many low-income villages along coastlines are protected by mangroves that protect them from storm surge, as well as providing habitat for fish and a source of wood for fire. There's this wonderful resource called Project Drawdown. You can find it online at drawdown.org, and they have over 100 different solutions to climate change that you can read about and share with people. A great way to start conversations is, did you know? And then tell them something about green and cool roofs or heat pumps, or how educating girls in low-income countries is a climate solution, how you love your electric car, or how you're contributing to a clean cook stove program. There's all kinds of amazing solutions that make people's lives better today, as well as in the future tomorrow. I love talking about what's already happening. The fact that there are entire countries on board with climate solutions. There are young people on board, there are mothers on board, there are senior citizens on board. I actually got to meet some of the warrior moms of India last time I was at a climate meeting. There's churches on board all over the world. There's universities and colleges on board everywhere you turn. There's companies that are on board. Yes, some of the biggest companies in the world. Google searches have been carbon neutral since 2007. It says at the bottom, if you ever go to the Google page and notice. Cities are on board. They're making huge changes to cut their carbon emissions and become more climate resilient. And you know what? All of this matters, because what does the science conclude? The science concludes that every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice matters. What we individually do, what we collectively do as a family, what we collectively do as a neighborhood, what we collectively do as a city or a state, what we collectively do as a company, as a college, as a church, as an organization or group, what we do matters. And how does action begin? It begins when someone says something. Hey, have we thought about doing this? They're doing it over there. Why don't we do this here? Hey, I'm doing this. Maybe you'd like to do it too. That is how action begins. And the benefits is that climate actions can change the world, because it isn't just about climate change. They also give us cleaner air and water, and who doesn't want that? They protect us from disasters like storms and wildfires and floods, and who doesn't want that? They improve our physical and our mental health. They give us more affordable energy, not less. They reduce our inequalities. They create healthy ecosystems and food systems, and they give us a more stable world. So climate changes and we get worried, but how do you break the cycle of doom? Here's where we break it. Instead of sharing more doom-filled facts or starting an argument with somebody who doesn't agree with you, share how it affects us personally. Connect your head to your heart, and then connect your heart to your hands. What do solutions look like that we can do? And then people feel like, oh, okay, there's something I can do about it. That's when action results, and that's how our brains are wired. To go back to the neuroscience, our brain is built to associate forward action with a reward, not avoiding harm. So, and she's not talking about climate change here, but she is too, right? So reframe what you say so the information you provide induces hope, not dread. So why does this matter? It matters because, as George Marshall, who's a great thinker in the area of climate change, says, he says, talk is the fertile field in which cultural change begins. In its absence, we can't fix a problem. Talk is necessary, essential, critical to doing anything. It's not sufficient, obviously. If we just talk and never do anything, we're never going to fix it. but talk is the fertile field in which the change begins. And the goal of this conversation is not to tell people about something, it is to expand the number of people in the conversation and bring them in. So I want to close by talking about, well, okay, how do we start? Because when I wrote my book, Saving Us, 2 years ago, I asked my sister to give it a read before I handed it in. And she read it and she said, "You're missing a chapter." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She's like, "Well, you're missing a chapter on how to actually have a conversation. Like, where do you start?" And I thought, she's right, I am missing that chapter. So how do we start having these conversations? Well, the best place to start is with something that you have in common with whoever you're talking to and speaking with. So I do an inventory. So what do I have in common with people? Well, first of all, I'm a scientist, obviously. So if people are really into science, I can start there. I am a Canadian, so I can start with talking about what's happening in the place where we're from. I live in Texas, which is actually the most vulnerable state in the country to these extreme weather disasters that we're getting. So I can certainly have conversations with people about that. I'm a mother, so I can have conversations about our kids. I'm a Christian, so I can have conversations there. I follow and I learn from and I plug into organizations that share my values. So I learn more about how they connect to climate change. Like what? Well, I ski. So I learned from Protect Our Winters how climate change is affecting skiing and winter sports. Like I said, I'm a mother. And so I'm part of an organization called Science Moms that help mothers figure out how climate change is affecting our kids and what we as moms can do to protect our kids. I'm a Christian, so I support organizations like Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. I'm a scientist, so I support and work with organizations like the National Museum of Natural History to help them communicate about climate change because museums are very trusted sources. And I serve as chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, which protects the land and the water on which all life depends. So these are the ways that I often connect with people and start conversations. But what about you? Well, I'll tell you, you can do this too, and it works. I've done experiments where we had short 1-minute videos talking about climate change from a faith-based perspective or a national security perspective or a free market values perspective. And the Yale people who create the same maps I just showed you, they studied the impact of these 1-minute videos we did, and it changed people's minds because we were starting where people were at instead of on something we disagreed on. So where can you start? Well, the good news is you're already there, right? You already have so much in common with people who are part of your organization around the world, as well as where you live. And there's so many things that you can share with people who care about the natural world and who care about plants. Like what? Let me just give you a couple of examples. You can share with people that we don't need thermometers to tell that the world is warming. If we just look at natural thermometers, everything's from lilacs to blueberries to kudzu, we see 26,500 independent lines of evidence showing us that the world is warming, and some of them are right in people's own backyards, and you can tell them that. You can tell people that we're seeing phenological changes, and you can explain what that is too, that first leaf dates and first bloom dates are much earlier, that the times when birds are migrating are changing, that around the United States, the length of the growing season is a lot longer, and you're observing that. And you can talk to people about the impacts that we're seeing from that. We can share how, this is a peach tree from one of my colleagues. He had a peach tree in his backyard that he planted 30 years ago. And when he had to cut it down just a couple of years ago, it was blooming 3 weeks earlier in the year than when he planted it because he could see climate change. We can talk about how other things that are not so good are getting much more frequent and longer, like the ragweed season for pollen. The more CO2 there is in the atmosphere, the more pollen ragweed produces, and the ragweed season is getting a lot longer because it's warmer. We can share things like, this is the National Arbor Day Foundation map they originally made of the plant hardiness zones. This is from USDA. And then they showed that by 2012, watch very carefully and don't blink here, the plant hardiness zones had shifted almost one entire zone, no matter where you were in the United States. This affects gardeners. It affects people who care about plants. We see how changes in bird abundance are shifting poleward as it gets warmer. We're seeing how different tree species are shifting northward as it gets warmer. These are some projections I did for the western or eastern United States of where different trees would be in the future. And you can see that oak hickory is spreading all through the Northeast, taking over the maple, birch, and beech forests. You can talk about invasive species, how a warmer world is certainly making invasive species move across our area, whether it's ants or plants or Japanese knotwood or kudzu or deer ticks. And we can talk about the increased risk, not just to humans, but to plants, from redwoods to avocados. You know about this and you can talk to people about this. So what do we scientists talk about? Well, I've got one colleague, he talks about how he's electrifying his house to reduce air pollution and carbon emissions. I have another colleague who talks about how she bikes to work and she goes biking with her kids and plants trees on the weekends. That's Kim. I talk about the solar panels we put on our roof. I have another colleague who plays Fortnite and talks about climate change while he's playing Fortnite. That's Henry. I love sharing stories like the majority of people in the energy sector are now employed in clean energy jobs. Isn't that good news? Or when we just put carbon labels on menus, that changes the type of food that people order. That's good news. Or putting in roundabouts actually helps with climate change too, and reducing traffic accidents. That's good news. In fact, there's so much good news out there now that I collect it. And I know that you're doing this too. So I read your newsletter, your magazine, and you featured members who are doing things. So Margaret from Canada is taking small steps, like first of all, getting rid of her plastic paint trees. And you know what else she's doing? She's talking about it, right? Laura from Charlottesville, Virginia, she's looking very carefully at the companies that she uses to source the paints that she uses, and she's supporting small eco-conscious companies, and she's talking about it and sharing it with you. Judy in Pennsylvania is planting native plant species and encouraging the use of them in people's gardens and sharing that information with people through her painting as well as through the conversations she's having. There's so much good news that I've started to create a monthly newsletter. If you're interested, you can take up your phone again and just take a picture of that QR code, or you can go to my website, which is just my name, KatharineHayhoe.com. And every month, every week, I should say, I share one piece of good news, one piece of not so good news, because we have to know what that is, and one thing that every one of us can do to try to address psychological distance and efficacy. So if you're looking for talking points, you can find them every single week in my newsletter. And when we see all the good things that are happening around the world, we realize the giant boulder of climate action is not sitting at the bottom of an impossibly steep cliff with only a few hands on it. It is already at the top of the hill. It is already rolling down the hill in the right direction. And if I add my hand and if I use my voice to encourage others to add theirs, it will go faster. Talking is like knocking over the first domino in that chain that leads to a better future. Because, to give you one last quote, and this is from someone who knows what she's talking about, Greta Thunberg, she says, the one thing that we need more than hope is action. Why? Because once we start to act, once we do something, anything, hope is all around us. So at this point, the only question left is, what are we waiting for? And I have one final question for you. Now that you understand what's holding us back, now that you understand the vast magnitude of solutions they are, now that you understand that you're the perfect person to talk to people, to share a love of our incredible world that we live in, of the huge diversity of plant species that populate it, of how they contribute to human life, and of what we can do to help protect and preserve this incredible world. Now that you know that, go ahead back to Poll EV, because I have one question for you. Now, when I say climate change, how do you feel? Give me one word about how you feel when I say climate change now. I love that. I love hopeful, but I also love proactive, because where do we find hope? We find that hope in action. Rather than waiting to feel hopeful and then acting, we have to act. We have to be motivated. We have to be informed. We have to be focused. We have to be talkative. We have to be ready. And then that is where we find our hope. When we act, hope is all around us. So that's what I want to leave you with today. I hope I've given you things to talk about, things to share, things to feel hopeful about. If you want more, like I said, I have that weekly newsletter where I've got so many hopeful things. I'm starting to think that I should be doubling or tripling up on the good news every week. There is bad news too, and that's part of our rational hope, is recognizing that it is still bad. So if you still feel anxious, if you still feel concerned, again, that is a logical response to the information that science is giving us. But we also know from the science that our actions make a difference. We truly can change the world, and it begins with something so simple again. Like I said, we often skip right over it. It begins with a conversation today. Thank you. So I'm going to ask Emmeline to come back on. Emmeline, are you there? There you are.
Yes. Thank you so much, Catherine. That was wonderful to hear all of your insight on what we can do. And I know we have a lot of questions about just that, what sort of a daily, what we can do as an individual on a daily basis. And you've already highlighted a few of our members who are making small steps, but if you can talk a little bit to that, more to that point, I think we would appreciate it.
Absolutely. So if you go to Poll Everywhere Now, you will see that the questions are still up, and you can ask a new question, or you can look at the questions that people have already put up there and you can upvote them. And we have a lot of questions here. So the number one question is, what can I as an individual do about this crisis on a daily basis? And my answer is this: do something, anything, and talk about it. Because when we just focus on ourselves, we're looking at our personal footprint, and that's important. But what's more important is our shadow, how we interact with people around us, where we live, the organizations we're part of, where we work, where we study, where we worship. When we talk about this with others, that is how we affect change. So yes, I change my light bulbs and I talk about it. Yes, I try a new plant-based recipe and then I talk about it. Yes, I'm checking out one of those, kitchen-based composters and I'm talking about it with people. What do you think about this? Have you tried it? How does it work? And I'm also talking with people where I work. Like, why are we flying to all these meetings? Can't we be doing this online, or shouldn't we be finding a location that people can drive to instead of having to fly? What are we doing in terms of where we get our energy ourselves? Why don't we have an electric vehicle fleet or places for people to plug in their cars when they come to work? Where does our university get their energy from? What are we teaching our students? What classes are we offering to them? How are we equipping them to be citizens in this warmer world? Whoever we are, we can do something. And so my simple answer to that top question is do something, anything, and talk about it. Share it with people around you, online, in person, or sometimes even we can talk about something by just doing something and other people seeing us doing it.
We have another question about population growth. Does population growth make all these changes even harder?
Well, that is a great question. And there's no doubt that having 8 billion people on the planet as opposed to 1 million is a very, very different world. That is why our future truly is in our hands. Back when there was, hardly any people on the planet, our future wasn't in our hands. We weren't big enough. There wasn't enough of us to affect the planet. But today we know that there are. But it isn't the numbers of us, it's how we live. Remember back a while ago, I shared that the 50% poorest people in the world are responsible for 7% of this problem. Just 7%. So, there was that Avengers movie where they have Thanos, that big purple guy, and he has that special glove and he snaps his fingers and like half the people in the universe disappear because he thinks the universe is overpopulated. Well, if you did that and the 50% poorest people in the world disappeared, it really wouldn't affect the problem at all. The challenge is that too few of us are using too much. And we're doing it in an unsustainable way that produces all type of waste and uses more than we need. Like I said, we waste 67% of the energy we produce, and we waste 50% of the food that we produce. People are going hungry when there's just food literally rotting because we're producing too much and we're not sending it to people who need it. So not only that, but the countries that have the highest birth rates, and I talk about this in my book too, they're the places where women don't have access to education. They don't have access to basic health care. They often live in societies where women aren't allowed to choose how many children they have. And so educating women and girls, giving them healthcare is a climate solution, but not imposing any type of control, but just actually giving people the choice on how they live. And that's why, again, climate solutions are good for many different reasons, not just climate.
How can we get our legislators and our politicians to take climate change a little bit more seriously, to take action? I know this is something that you touched on, how polarizing it is. And it's specifically an issue here in the US. I wonder if you could talk about that.
It is. And it's not just in the United States. We see it in Canada, we see it in the UK, we see it in Australia too. I'm putting a couple of resources in the chat. I mentioned the newsletter. You can sign up there at my website. I mentioned my book, Saving Us. You can find it there. Also, if you're interested in the Yale climate opinion maps that I shared, if you want to dig down and find your congressional district or your county, let's see, I'll put that in here. And how do we talk to our politicians is a question I often get. And the answer is politicians are humans. They really are, maybe just a special category of humans. And so with politicians, because they hear from so many people, it is even more important to begin with something they already care about. And if we don't know what that is, we need to find out what it is. What's important to their district? What's important to their constituents? What's important? What values do they have themselves that they advocate for? Start with something they already care about, not something that they don't care about, and help connect the dots to how climate change affects that, whatever it is they care about, and how climate action helps. And in some cases, you don't even have to use those words. I live in Texas, where a lot of farmers who are not on board with the idea that climate is changing due to human activities, they have wind turbines on their land. And when I ask them why, they're like, well, because the check arrives in the mail, and there is nothing wrong with that. So climate solutions have other benefits. And sometimes the way to get people on board is just talk about the other benefits. And oh, if it helps climate change too, well, that's the icing on the cake.
Going off of that, why do people not take action until they're personally affected?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's because of that psychological distance I talked about. Our human brains are just not wired to act on risk that we see as not being imminent. We're just wired to react to, the bear running at us, or the floodwaters coming into our home at this moment. Our brains are not wired to take in information about what's going to be happening in the future and to make decisions ahead of time. And this happens even, like I said, on very non-controversial subjects. Like everybody knows we shouldn't be eating this much sugar or fats. Everybody knows that, we should be saving this much money. Everybody knows we're supposed to be exercising more than we are, right? We all know that, but we aren't doing it until something happens. And then we're like, oh my gosh, yes, I'm going to be careful now. So I was actually just out with one of my friends this weekend, and she took a risk and ended up injuring her knee. And, in retrospect, you're like, that was such a stupid thing to do. Why even do that? Why even bother? But until it actually happens, you don't really see that it could happen to you. That's just something that happens to other people. In fact, we were talking about it earlier, and I said, well, I like to quit a bit earlier because I'm worried about my knees. And she's like, oh, I don't worry about my knees at all. So this is just the way we're wired as humans. And so that's why telling these stories and painting these pictures is so important, not just about the benefits of solutions, but also about connecting, again, our head to our hearts, talking about what I see happening, how it's affecting me, my family, people I know, places I've been, and telling stories about what those risks look like and how they would affect us. Because it's so interesting when we tell stories as humans, neuroscientists have found that it actually synchronizes our brain waves and it gives us empathy for each other. So telling those stories about what's happened to us or people we know, and telling stories about how these solutions benefit us or people we know or people we've read about, this is really how we can help all of us kind of overcome the hardwiring in our brains and make decisions now rather than in the future when it's too late.
And what do you think would be the impact of decreasing our purchase of food products from far away that are out of season where we live? Will we be punishing people in Central America or Mexico, but lowering carbon footprint by not importing food?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, food miles does contribute to the carbon emissions. But surprisingly, and I was surprised by this myself, so I had to look at the data. Surprisingly, what's even more important is what we eat. So in other words, and a lot of the sort of very cheap meat that we get is coming from places like Brazil, where they're cutting down the rainforest to farm cattle. So really making sure that we're buying local, that we're buying sustainable, and that when we're eating meat, the lower down the food chain, the better. So fish is the best type of meat to eat, or seafood, and that's better than chicken, but chicken's better than pork, and pork is better than beef, especially factory farm beef. If you're gonna buy beef, buy it from a local producer who is grass fed, because when you graze cattle, it can actually put some of that carbon back in the ground instead of releasing it into the atmosphere. To get a little technical, they poop and then they trample it into the ground. And that's how it gets into the soil, but you're botanists, so that's okay. And really looking for ways that we can eat lower down the food chain. It is really important, and it's ways to share that information with other people. And you know what the benefit is? First of all, it's often more affordable, and it's better for our health too, right? So there's all kinds of pluses, and it's not about all or nothing. Every little thing that we do matters.
And what would you say are the best national, state, local organizations to join that would help us advocate for and participate in helping climate change?
That is a great question. I love that question. And there are so many wonderful organizations to join. On social media every once in a while, and I think I probably need to start doing this in my newsletter, I try to share organizations that people might connect with. So for example, if you're a person of faith, there's all kinds of different organizations for people of faith. If you're, I highlighted a few, if you're a mom, if you're a skier, if you're a gardener, if, whoever you are, there's organizations that are using their voices to advocate for change. One of the most effective ones I know of is called Citizens Climate Lobby. They have chapters in every state in the country, as well as in almost every country in the world. And they're specifically about advocating with elected officials in a bipartisan way to say, hey, a thermometer doesn't give us a different answer depending on how we vote. So let's work on sensible climate solutions for Utah or for Pennsylvania or for Florida that help people here and now today, as well as help all of us to a better future tomorrow.
Somebody was asking about battling, how does one work to ban gas-powered leaf blowers when the town is resistant? How can somebody, fight a battle locally and get other people on board?
Well, local action is tremendously powerful. So often we think of it as just, oh, that's just something presidents do. No, action can happen at every scale, and those leaf blowers are a great example. So what you have to do is start the conversation with something that whoever you're speaking with, whether it's a city council person or a neighbor, whoever, with something they care about. So they might not care about the carbon emissions, but they might care about the noise because, oh my gosh, it makes a lot of noise. Or they might care about the air pollution. Or they might simply care about, hey, whenever it runs out, I always have to go get gas, and then you have to take a little thing to the gas station, fill it up, come home. You know what? I just got an electric one. It's so much easier. I just plug it in the garage. I never have to go get gas. In fact, that's the biggest seller for my husband with an electric car. He's like, I hate going to the gas station. I'm always running out of gas. So start with whatever they care about. And if you don't know what it is, ask them. And then connect the dots to how this will be a solution for whatever it is they care about. Because you know what? If one person decides they're going to support electric leaf blowers because they just hate going to the gas station, and another person supports them because they don't produce harmful air pollution, and another person supports them just because they don't like the noise, it doesn't matter. All too often, I think we make the mistake of thinking everybody has to care about it for the same reason we do. And that means that we're creating a very narrow gate. So just imagine, let me give you an example that's so specific, it'll sound ridiculous, but it's something that we all do. So climate change is affecting birds. And in fact, the Baltimore Oriole might no longer be native to Baltimore if we don't fix climate change. So there are a lot of people who are passionate birders and who might be from Baltimore, and that really means a lot to them that the Oriole would not be native to Baltimore. But imagine if everybody had to care about the Baltimore Oriole in order to get on board with climate action. That's just unrealistic. That's just not going to happen. So we have to figure out what gate those people have to this issue, and it might be different than mine, but it's totally okay. We can all agree this is the right solution for whatever problem it is that we have.
And what do you think the most important thing for our children to learn about climate change is?
Well, this is something that I think about a lot as a mother myself, and the program I'm part of, ScienceMoms.com, I'll put a link to that in the chat too, because it's a great program with lots of resources for people. ScienceMoms.com. There we go. With our kids do need to know it's real, but even more, they need to know that there are solutions and that kids are involved in creating those solutions. Kids are phenomenal. I have a little series called Global Weirding. I'll put that in the chat too on YouTube. And it answers frequently asked questions. So it's just Global Weirding. Whoops, I'm spelling it wrong. globalweirdingseries.com. I answer frequently asked questions. And one of the biggest questions I started to get was, I'm just a kid. What can I do? So I started to research what kids are doing, and I was blown away and humbled and really thinking, you know, we adults need to get on the ball here because kids are phenomenal. You've got like a 9-year-old interviewing experts around the world on his podcast series that he puts on YouTube. Or you've got students serving on city councils to evoke climate action. You've obviously got kids with signs sitting outside of buildings. You've got kids saving their schools tens of thousands of dollars through energy efficiencies programs that they design themselves, not their teachers. I mean, kids are phenomenal. They're inventing ways to, you know, grow algae biofuel, an experiment they conducted under their bed. Kids are amazing, and we need to tell our kids that they have so much that they can do with our help, but it's not on them. It's not their responsibility. It is our responsibility to fix this, but part of our responsibility is to empower them, to give them that sense of efficacy that they truly can make a difference and their future is in their hands.
Well, thank you so much, Katharine. I think we're just out of time, but this has been a really wonderful segment. Your presentation was very uplifting and empowering. I know I'm taking a slightly deeper breath and, you know, going to go forth with the small changes that I can make and having those conversations. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be with you today, and I hope I've given you some resources that you can use in the future. And for more, you know, you can find me on social media. I am on Pinterest and Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and TikTok and a lot of other things. And I'm just trying to share this information to get our conversation started. So if you have something that you think I should share with other people, feel free to send that to me. You can send it through my website or you can send it through any social media channel, because I love to get ideas from people to share with other people. And the bottom line is to get us all talking. Thank you.